cannot afford peace personally. If the whirligig stops going round, if the roundabout stop goes, he falls off.
Hello and welcome to Times Zero Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're very privileged to be talking to the defence editor and commentator with the Evening Standard, Robert Fox. Robert's been a journalist for, I think, over 54 years, according to one of your sites. And as I said, you're currently the defence security editor and foreign commentator and reviewer at the Evening Standard. You're an honorary fellow of the Strategic Studies Institute at Exeter, Associate Fellow for the Centre of Defence Studies at KCL, a commentator and foreign affairs reporter for Reaction. Robert, welcome back to Frontline.
Hello.
Always good to talk to you. Now, we've got the NATO conference on at the moment. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, in The Hague yesterday, assessed that Russia is the largest existential threat to NATO members today, and Russia's preparing for a protracted war with NATO. He said with NATO. And then Chancellor Merz, the new German Chancellor, said for too long we in Germany didn't want to hear our Baltic neighbours warning about Russia's imperialist policies. We have recognised this mistake. There is no going back from this realisation. Are they right? And do you think we're going to see a significant change in European defence politics?
I think there is a change on the way. I'm always worried about, Philip, about adjectives in this with significant, because we've been around this one before. But I think that what we can say, whatever Rutte, Trump, and Trump is very important in all this for more than obvious reasons, whatever they're saying, we are very much into NATO, possibly phase 2 or phase 3. And I think it's going to divide. I think it's going to be like a seed. It's going to be dichotomous. You will have European-focused NATO, for which it was originally designed, and then all the other bits and pieces. And the indispensable godfather at the feast, of course, always is, as things are constituted, America. Because actually, I was reading Ben Hodges and Robert Hunter, two very experienced Americans on this. Actually, the alliance is not capable of doing anything on its own. And for all the blather that we've had from the EU and about the EU Defence Initiative, which is quite serious, but no way can they run a coordinated, strategic, operational machine, which is capable of fighting conventionally and non-conventionally. I don't mean nuclear by that, but asymmetrically on more than one front and with more than one or two corps. I mean, corps, C-O-R-P-S. We've got to be very careful about that. So that's where we are. We are in a new nuclear age. We almost didn't need, but unfortunately we have had the reminder of the debacle. We're in a very serious position with Iran and Israel. It's there. There will be proliferation across the Middle East, across Eurasia, and very possibly even to Latin America. We're in a very dicey place, and where NATO interests are involved. And having said, we've had a blizzard of reports. We've had the Strategic Defence Review. We had the National Security Strategy yesterday. And as Mr. Sherlock Holmes would say, the dog that did nothing, that didn't bark, was the China audit. So sensitive, so difficult was this, it couldn't have full publication, from which I infer China, globally, strategically, is actually, it can play frenemy, friendly foe, whatever, but it is a much bigger threat, medium to long term, than Russia will be.
Well, interesting. Larissa Brown on X today, or Twitter, as I always call it, it'll always be Twitter, turned around and said, Trump is the daddy who sorts out warring parties in the Middle East, according to Mark Rutte. I think calling him the daddy is a quote from Mark Rutte, who's the Secretary General of NATO. And Trump's focus is China rather than Europe and the Middle East. Is he the daddy who sorted out the Middle East? And is he right focusing on China rather than elsewhere?
Well, the trouble is, I know Larissa's father very well. He's a very nice Lancastrian. I think that, and I wouldn't accuse my esteemed friend of the Times newspaper, first-rate correspondent, of having a daddy complex. But I think, and knowing she's also a first-rate writer, of course, daddy carries the overtone of Godfather with it, and I think that's what Larissa is getting. Where Larissa is right, though, and she gets it absolutely there, you cannot go round Trump. Trump, he's not quite the immovable object. He is actually the mercurial object. He changes his mind about almost everything under the sun. To answer your question, there are one or two things that he doesn't change his mind about. He hasn't changed his mind, and we saw the fruit of that, about Iran not getting a nuclear weapon. He is absolutely hardcore about that. And he is hardcore that the Pacific imperative, but that is the Pacific Ocean, the Indo-Pacific, really must be the main attraction with Trump. Interestingly, where he can change his mind, and peculiarly, goodness, I never thought I'd use this term in relation to Donald Trump, he can show nuance with regard to Putin, because Putin, I think, frankly, if I could use the expression on an esteemed organ like Times Radio and Times newspapers, I think that Trump, in his Trumpish way, thinks that Putin is making a bit of an arse of himself at the moment. And one can but agree, because while all this has been going on in the Middle East, while Trump has been arguing about NATO, while NATO has been arguing about NATO, there have been some very peculiar things coming out of the Kremlin as Russia tries to get a conclusion, a conclusive result from its summer offensive. The summer offensive is bloody, it's bloody and awful. And, you know, they've just gone past the millionth casualty on the battlefield since the war began in 22. But it is far from conclusive, even that operation. And in terms of this conversation, quite rightly, is going all over the place because the world strategic scene is all over the place. And that's the big message that the Starmer government is worrying about, because it's not getting it through to the British public, how messy it all is.
Well, look at how messy it all is. You mentioned some of the things that have happened in the UK. We've had the Strategic Defence Review. We've had the Spending Review. We've now had the National Security Review. We've had partial release on thoughts of China. Is our government providing a coherent map for the future, or are we seeing incoherent because it is so complex and they're just not getting it?
The welcome mat to number 10 has written underneath, welcome to Castle Incoherence. But what I would say, and it's not, perhaps I'm getting sentimental in old age, approaching, or you may say even arrived, or train left the station of senility, but I am finding among younger officers and younger, even diplomats, of people on the edges of academe, there's some quite good, sharp, I'm not going to tick their box original academic, blah, blah, blah. I hate all that stuff, but quite ingenious thinking. And the operators, I am now finding much, much better, speaking against myself, and I really mean to do that, much better than the commentators. The commentariat in the mainstream is a real weakness, and I do have sympathy with the government there. I think they shouldn't bank on it to get the message across, whether it's all three, whether it's broadcast in both dimensions or newspapers or online. It's very difficult to show the clear and present dangers that we're in and the different kinds of risks that we face. And that's why I think the work that John Bew did, and they didn't give him much time, with the national security strategy, it's an open question, but it's a think on open question. It has very, very good talking points, as indeed does the Strategic Defence Review. But then it fudged it by being a fudge of a fudge. Whenever you got to a difficult point in some of the more exotic kinds of warfare that are coming up, the Strategic Defence Review said, "Oh, we'll have a committee. We'll think about this. There'll be a study pending funds, whatever the economy is doing." When I was at uni, one of the best speakers I have ever heard in my life was Robert Kennedy. That's Robert Kennedy Sr., who was the Attorney General. And he came over to Oxford, and he'd come over from Ditchley, and I think his 8th child had just been born to Ethel at that time. And we asked him, the students, about birth control and birth rates in Africa. And he, that wonderful Bostonian ring, I found him even more engaging than his brother. He said, "As you understand, this is a hypothetical for me personally, in view of what has just happened, But we do have a study group looking into this question." And to 3 of his answers, it was absolutely wonderful. We do have a study group. And whenever I read this in the burble from Whitehall, I think, God, come in, Bobby. We have a study group. It's no excuse for anything. What I would like to add about the reviews, and nobody, I wouldn't imagine they would mention it. And this is really memory lane. We need to go back 120 years to the report by the committee led by an unusual eccentric called Lord Isha about what we should learn from the near defeat in the Boer War. And this is absolutely pertinent today. It is the most beautifully written report. And Isha, who was an eccentric, he was a courtier, and he said, one of the worst things you should do when you study anything, you should not rely on committees. You need groups of individual brains. And when you report, it should be a single mind, finally, producing the report. He had a very good secretary who wrote, a high-powered secretary who wrote that report. And I'm sorry, I do praise John Bew for this. I saw his hand that he drove that national security strategy because it's consistent. When you look at the Strategic Defence Review, it looks like the medieval documentation that I looked at in my youth, in my PhD studies. And the great expression was, this is a work of many hands. And you could see actually the handwriting of the monks changed. Gosh, the Strategic Defence Review really was the work of many hands, and one would say, being polite, many brains. It's all over the place in its conclusion, I think.
Yes, well, reviews by committee, and no matter how good the experts that you've got, if people, the decision makers, don't listen to the experts and are formulating their own opinions, then that's a real thing of that will cause problems in the future. And one of the people that doesn't seem to be listening to his experts and all the rest is Vladimir Putin. Today's Russian newspapers have highlighted that housing and utility tariffs are about to rise by 11.9%. Russia's on the verge of recession. They ask, will oil prices after Donald Trump's settlements in the Middle East fall below $60 a barrel? And is suggesting that there are moves that discredit Russian moral, spiritual values, and it's going to have an issue across the country. Do you think Putin realizes just what a position he's in, and can Russia continue to afford its war with Ukraine, or can he not afford what the peace would be if he went and sought for peace?
Well, let's answer that one first. He cannot afford peace personally. If the whirligig stops going round, if the roundabout stop goes, he falls off, very possibly. What he is doing is that he can keep it going despite recession. My appraisal of this, because China will keep them going medium term, looking to 2030. No, he can't keep it going. And what is the symptom of this is the sort of rather panicky remarks he is making about, well, we've got to get the CSTO, this cluster of states to the southeast, the Central States Treaty Organization. He wants the latest to bring them under direct military command of the Kremlin, which means impressed service. We know they've been taking mercenaries from the far, far east, and I mean that right across, and they've been looking to labor from North Korea, because we've heard about the battalions, but apparently there are many, many more, tens of thousands, laborers being brought on. And I think that what will create, this is where, of course, Ukraine and the Ukrainian war machine is in always running overheat, and it's in terrible trouble, and recruiting particularly is going to be difficult. But they do seem to be saying, despite what anybody else is saying, including Merz, including Trump, they are fighting the depth battle now, it seems to me. I saw an assessment, Philip, I don't know whether you saw it the other day, that they've written down 10% of the total Russian rail network, the total one. Now, you can't go on doing that because they need the rail to supply the front. And I think they probably, very soon, they could have too many at the front. If you've got a great big army you can't supply with food and fuel, let alone ammunition, you're in trouble. I think that was probably one of the lessons of 1917 when you had a massive blob there. And that's why, and I think it is worrying, we're seeing Putin getting quite wild. It's very interesting how Lukashenko in Belarus started letting political prisoners go, because I think he thinks he's next. I would not be at all surprised to see a move de facto, if not de jure, to annex Belarus within the next few months. I mean, he's eroding very successfully Georgia, but Georgia isn't anything like as strategic for the immediate fight as Belarus is, and I think he's trying to spread the pain, and that's why I think the NATO frontline states, particularly the Baltics, Finland, Poland, Norway, and then Sweden, but the ones with a near common frontier, and you have to put Sweden on there, I think they're right to be very, very worried. And they're right to say to the NATO alliance, and they've been saying it to Scholz, get a bit more lead in your pencil.
So you and I are singing off the same song sheet when it comes to the operational level of war. Do you think Zelensky and his team are right at focusing on what they're doing and writing down this Russian operational level, their railways, their oil refining capability, their strategic bombers, their airfields, they're assassinating their generals, knowing full well that they can't generate sufficient combat power to have a decisive effect at the tactical level? Or do you think the Ukrainians are trying to balance both off? Are they going to try a tactical counterattack themselves this summer?
No, I don't think they should. And I wonder if the message is getting through. They've had some very good NATO advisors, I think, whom we should probably keep quiet about, and saying that you made a terrible mess with your summer offensive of 23, where they tried to do an all arms, which they can't do, by the way. And they can't do anything much above even approaching division level. They operate as really rather independent brigades. And a lot of the really good Brit analysis that I've seen, and they've been working it through with the Poles as well, and it's very sensible, saying, make a virtue out of your vice, and it's not necessarily a vice. As you know, Fibua, the old fighting in built-up areas. The one thing that, particularly in trying to do the policing in West Belfast in the very early days, the worst thing is when you had to try and have an all-coordinated battle group operation. Then you got individual company groups and platoons shooting at each other. Well, much the same seems to apply of what's going on in Ukraine. And you've got these rather ferocious, I think, eye-wateringly frightening brigades, but doing their own thing as to running their own procurement chains. But some of them are absolutely ingenious. You know, whoever's going to be the future czar of Legoland should get out there and find out how to do it. This do it yourself, putting things together, getting resupply from the rear, but understanding what they do at the front and what you have to assemble at the front, I think has been completely brilliant. And of course, they have setbacks. You get new innovations like the optic fiber drones. The place is festooned with optic fibers, which must be quite an obstacle now. They seems to be moving around that and moving to it. But I think the thing that's going to get the lawfare rather than warfare people going is that I think they're focusing very heavily on the operational depth battle now. That they're really going to plug away. But the other thing where they have fed British military doctrine is maintaining the strategic and active rear, which is this thing that, you know, the defense correspondents were completely baffled when Rowley Walker and his team came up with the idea that the battle we're looking at is the back to front battle, the front to the back and the back to the front. And actually, when you heard them describe it, and knowing a few of the coves involved, and they have learned very directly from the Ukrainians, it makes absolute sense. And that's what the British Orback with the army is going to be. The concentration on the flexible, capable rear that you've got to be able to. We're not going to be on the front line in Europe, but that's absolutely understood. We will have the Rapid Reaction Corps as the flexible second line reserve. And then it all begins to make sense. We lead with Germany and Poland on the front on one side, and France. If you ever get France to do anything cooperatively that they felt that they haven't invented themselves, you'll be lucky. But that's the way it works. But you can say that I'm sort of a bit bouncy about this. That I just feel a lot of the torpor is going away in NATO now because they know probably they might have used the rather naughty word that Trump used yesterday. Otherwise, you know, we are completely done if we allow things to go on as they did.
Well, yeah, and going on as they did, it's interesting you talk about the inventiveness of the Ukrainians and everything else. Zelensky at the NATO summit turned around and said that Ukraine is only utilizing 60% of its domestic military production due to a lack of funds, and could produce over 8 million drones a year. That's, the mind boggles with that.
I think they could, by the way.
Yeah, I think we've got 3 FPV drones in the British Army at the moment. And then Rutte comes back in and says, it's simply unthinkable that Russia, with an economy 25 times smaller than NATO's, should be able to outproduce us and outgun us. And this is what we need to understand. Russia's as a threat only really exists because we allow it. Are we starting to wake up to a realization that we should be beating them through our greater economic strength, and do we have the political will to do it? And are we getting our support for Ukraine wrong?
I think I don't want to use weasel words. We have to adjust it. And yes, there are things that are wrong. Quite right, Philip. But you see, the thing is, one doesn't want to give the game away. But I think that this is where our operatives, who've really learnt the lesson, are doing the workaround. Where is the best British tactical and sub-operational drone production? It's all to do with Ukraine, and a hell of a lot of it is in Ukraine. That's the really interesting thing. They know this blah 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 because the Brits actually do know that as you know, they've learnt the lesson of ghastly things like Ajax and Watchkeeper. Watchkeeper in its day was a perfectly decent drone, and oops, as you know, we used it really rather a lot when it was called the Hermes LH-415. It was under contract, piloted for us by Israelis. I think we'll keep quiet about the rest of that.
Piloted by people who knew how to pilot things rather than people who knew how to fire artillery shells.
Absolutely. And I think this is the story. And I think the sense of workaround, I do think, is very, very good indeed at the moment. And because I think that this is where the armed forces are acting absolutely in their own interest, because take risk, it's going to be a bit hairy, but that's part of the contract with the nation if you join the armed forces. But actually, you can use your brains and move around. I do quite like it. All 3 major services are now saying you can join us, but don't have to wear a uniform or bash a square. But which is quite good. They're very keen. They're very keen on that. But where I worry, I was hearing Vice Admiral Burns, the fleet commander, yesterday, give a very good talk, saying where the Navy is. We must have a national conversation. Well, the conversation is there to be had, but the way they're going about it, I don't blame them. But the way they're going about it is completely hopeless. And I'm afraid you don't go around about trying to generate a serious national conversation about this kind of thing on the Today programme or Channel 4 News.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of mixed messaging and confusion coming out. On the way across to The Hague on Air Force One, Donald Trump refused to define what Article 5 support meant to him and the US, and is suggesting that there's different interpretations. We've seen Spain. We've seen Spain opting out of the defense expenditure up to 5% that's going through. Is Donald Trump actually trying to rewrite the founding principle of NATO, which is Article 5, attacking one is attacking all, or is he just being practical?
First, find your pen, to rewrite it. Spain, I think, is hilarious, and that came out just at the time that when they asked Spain to do a bit of about not revealing the overflight of the B2s into the Iran-Israel airspace, and what Sanchez came up with, I did find very interesting and does show, to answer your question, where we're going on this. We get what we can from NATO. We're not a major player, and we're not on the major NATO front, although Spain is on a very important front across the Maghreb. And we understand that, and we put in what we expect to get out. And for the time being, they're saying, Spain, we have got such a point of main effort on other fronts at the moment. They let that sit. And it must be said that Spain has done its bit in the Red Sea and things like that. Not great, I understand. But that is not a rule. They could say, oh, but that's a precedent. Now, about Trump, I really rather like it. He couldn't quote Article 5 for you. But where he is right, and I've looked at it with the British MOD, the interpretation of Article 5, it's not one of the 10 commandments. It's not absolutely... Philip, you know this. It is open to interpretation, and it was put to me like that. I think it was Ben Hodges, or one of our leaders, said, The response it's a request for solidarity, primarily, unless the whole world is going mad with a big thermonuclear attack. But if it's a regional incursion, say the Baltics, which is quite likely, we would expect a response of solidarity appropriate to the threat and action. So, and I do think that Latvia particularly is vulnerable at the moment, as is the Suwalki Gap. Now, I would not expect Spain or Luxembourg to put forces in for that, and they would not primarily be consulted, but you would expect the whole gang of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, the Baltics, and so on, right down to the Dutch. And I think the Dutch would take it seriously, and of course the Balkans, and we forget that, and they're in a very awkward position, Romania and Bulgaria. And I think that you do have to be pragmatic. Don't expect too much from Hungary under Orban, and you can't expect anything. And Czechia is very difficult because of Slovakia. That's reality and that's politics. But what I think NATO is very good at, supposing the balloon went up, supposing and it wasn't Armageddon. Supposing there was a real and a serious attack, and I think it's likely to come in space and cyber, the first next really serious invocation, it would go to the NAC, which is very difficult to explain to colleagues that actually, very strangely, NATO has a democratic credential. It pretends and it plays. And I think, it's my more generous interpretation of Trump, and I'm usually very ungenerous, but it's this thing about, it's what I call the Holly Golightly factor. In the famous novella, Breakfast at Tiffany's, you know why Holly Golightly played brilliantly, go and see the film again, by the glorious Audrey Hepburn. They said Holly Golightly wasn't really a phony. Do you remember why she wasn't a phony? She wasn't a phony because she was really phony about the things that she was phony about. And this is it. It's a game, and we play it, and let's do it. Let's call the 200 something delegates to the NAC and say, yeah, put it to you. Refer back to your parliament.
Well, we've only done it once, and that was supporting the United States over the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers, and and I've seen lots of NAC decisions and all the rest of it, and support can come in many different ways, from providing good military capability to you getting a moonpig card in the post saying, "Hey, we support you. Good luck," and all of that would fall into the Article 5 definition.
Didn't that happen in 91? Not the incursion into Iraq, but Iraq's incursion driving the Kurds across into Turkey. And Turkey did inquire quite legitimately whether this was an attack. And they considered it, and they said, no, there will be solidarity and support. And famously, Meteorong John Major, they did Operation Haven and put in that rescue mission for the Kurds. But it was discussed then, yeah.
Okay, you are hugely experienced, and you've been in a position where you're providing lots of advice to different people and different organizations. I'm now going to put you into the theoretical position where you are special advisor to President Zelensky. You're looking at what the future for Ukraine is, the conflict that's going on in Europe. What would you be giving him as advice as to how he can take things forward? And do you think the comment that came out of the new SACEUR, the new American general Grinkovich, who said to Congress as he was being assessed for his appointment, "Senator, I think Ukraine can win. I think when your own homeland is threatened, you fight with a stubbornness that is hard for us to understand unless we've been there ourselves." Could you bring that together and give Zelensky some decent advice?
I think he's like Marcus Aurelius. I think he's a Stoic, and I think that he looks at fate and tries to smile at it. And he is a tremendous. He knows victory isn't round the corner, but what he must do, which he is so skilled at, is to keep the military option and the diplomatic option going at the same time. And he knows he's got to deal with the gangsters over the border, but within his own border. He's got a very difficult situation. And the fact that the man must be absolutely exhausted, but he does have good relations, good personal relations. And the thing is that it is the goodwill of Europeans and we forget about it, the Ukrainian diaspora, which is so important. Yeah, Ukrainians in Australia, the Ukrainians in the US, but above all, the Ukrainian minority in Canada, which these must be listened to. And the thing is, the future of Ukraine, you are absolutely right to say, and he is right to say, it's got to be invested in. We've got to find the money for it. And I think if Putin shows any sign of aggression beyond expanding beyond Ukraine, and he looks to be almost on the cusp of it, then we've got to get those frozen assets. Just pull them out. You are an aggressor. Sorry, you're not going to get your rubles back. And pour it into Ukraine. And what they do seem to be doing sensibly is not doing the manufacture entirely in Ukraine, but in the surrounding area. And what worries me there with the new president, the election of the new old president, is Poland. Poland is absolutely, but the thing is that the Polish people sense, because of what you and I can see, Russia is doing, that Poland is threatened. What is Russia doing? Building all those installations, always up just about several hundred kilometers back from the line of confrontation, but facing the line of confrontation, particularly in Poland and Finland, as well as doing the noughties, and they will do it with cyber. I think in the Baltics. I think there is something on in some crazy conspectors, and it does look like the latter stages with the dictators in World War II, that Putin is up to some fantastical scheme. I think there's something odd. The psychodrama in his head is quite difficult to grasp. It is absolutely vitally important that we do.
Well, the amount of strategic ambiguity that's coming out from all leaders around the world. Final question today. Looking at, are we going to be talking about the conflict in Europe between Russia and Ukraine in 12 months' time, on 24 months' time? And does what's going on in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world mean that we're on a path to potentially global conflict?
Yes, yes, and yes. Because I think the conflict will go on, because even if there's a truce in Ukraine, I see, knowing the whole story of Central Europe, actually from Western through to the East, that you will have wars of revengeance, you will have civil wars, you will have, that's the problem. The Middle East is looking extremely concerning at the moment, because it does look to me as if we're in a phase of nuclear proliferation. And can it go global? It goes global if the main operational, tactical, and strategic MO of China is mischief. Because if it is, we're in trouble.
Well, Robert, on that note, I hope our politicians are listening. I hope the general public are listening, because that is why we're upping our defence expenditure significantly. We need to do it. But Robert, many thanks for chatting to me today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.